I'm also on the board of directors of the CFCA, and I want to thank the CFCA for having us today and thank all of you, because some of you are coming off a long weekend, and here you are on a next day, first business day back afternoon, spending time with us. But I'm so excited to share with you what Stacy and Katia want to cover today in reference to number transparency. So our session today is number transparency, the foundations of trust in global communications. And with that, I'm going to hopefully go to my next slide. There we are. And there's me. I'm Jaime. And Stacy, would you introduce yourself to this audience, which I think all know you, but maybe would like to hear a different title from you this time or something?
Absolutely. So Stacy Graham. Today I'm wearing my Sinch hat. So I'm here from Sinch, where I am the Senior Policy and Compliance Director. Along with Jaime, I also sit on the CFCA Board of Directors and the Somos Advisory Board. So definitely a subject that we are anxious to talk to you all about today.
Excellent. Thank you, Stacy. And Katia, would you please introduce yourself to this crew of people today? I think you might be on mute, at least for me.
I'm so sorry for this. I was saying that I'm certainly the newbie and I did something that newbies do. So sorry for that. So yeah, I'm Katia Gonzalez. I'm heading the Global Public Policy Strategy at Somos. I have been working, because again, I suppose many of you don't know me, I have been working on international telecommunications for like 20 years or so. And I have always been focused in fighting fraud and restoring trust in telecommunications, which is something that probably talks to most of you. I have little by little been more and more engaged into talking to regulators globally, because more and more there's a role for them to play in helping the industry get a better place for everybody. So yeah, that's me. Great to be here with you. Yeah, thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. So just set the stage. We're going to go through it. There's very few slides. It's going to be a lot more conversational. Those of you that have traveled with Stacy and I know that we don't have a hard time at all keeping the conversation going. And since we are headed next week to Sweden for the CFCA event, wanted to make sure you got to hear from Katia and hear some of the things that she's encountering. So if you're meeting us out in Sweden, you can have a conversation around this topic too. So this session is really going to talk about the fundamental principles surrounding the right to use of a telephone number. So when we think about, well, what does that mean? The word right to use is flying around all the time. Really, what does that mean? And when we're thinking about that, I want you to think about right to use as the individual entities along the path that have the right to use that phone number. Historically, we've thought about it as like, does this call have the right to use, or does this text have the right to use to pass through my network? Do I have a right to use to originate it on my network or terminate it on my network? And I think when this group is going to talk to you today, we're really going to hone in on the idea of, does that entity have the right to use that telephone number? And is there a way that we can prove that that entity has the right to do right to use that telephone number? So you might hear us say things like calls and texts and such, but this is really around the right to use the phone number, regardless of the medium and that we're choosing to use. So we think it's really important as we move forward in some of our slides here, is really talk about, well, what problem are we trying to solve? So we go through the process of talking about right to use, but why? And right to use is openly being discussed today in the regulatory environment. So we can look at anything that the FCC has talked about recently. Let it be the know your upstream provider. Let it be if it's the know your customer. Each of these that are looking at it from that perspective, from the FCC, right to use is being discussed, right? And as a group, we felt like phone number right to use is being required in many different use cases. So there's a lot of situations that happen today where knowing if this entity has the right to use that telephone number is really important, and it's coming forward. More and more use cases are coming forward. And there is a lot of different ways historically that RTU has been proven. So an example of that might be a regular old letter of agency, or an LOA, we say to it, right? For some of you know that have been at carriers for a really long time. I'm sure half of you won't admit it. Maybe David Franco will because he just joined the call. But we used to send LOAs via fax, right, to prove that you were able to take this action on a telephone number. And while we've progressed from a technology perspective well beyond that, but there's still paper LOAs that are out there. RTU is really hard to track down, and no one's really doing that. And I don't mean that as like, hey, we're not doing what we're supposed to do from a KYC perspective. I don't mean from a teleco provider that you're not doing what you need to do. I'm looking at it more from an entity perspective. I've had numerous conversations within an enterprise that say, well, that's my number. Oh, where is that your number? Like, where is that registered to? How do you know that? Oh, well, ask my carrier. Great. Wouldn't there be a great way for us to actually quantify that, to be able to take the word of the enterprise, to be able to ask the service provider that procured that phone number and say, does this entity have the right to use? And under what circumstances does that entity have the right to use? You might go, wait a minute. Wait, what did she just say? And I really mean this. There are some times where services are procured for an entity that might just be a direct inward dial type product, and you haven't actually given the rights to that entity to make an outbound call. Well, who's to know that? And where is that stored? And how do you check that? So thinking about it from that perspective, if we think about it, if we find a way that we can track it down and document it, does it really have to be that hard to deploy? We already have an ecosystem and an infrastructure to talk through it. So with that, we'll go then to what is RTU? RTU is the phone number. We then would talk with the service provider who procured it from the registry. There might be a reseller, one or two involved, and then the brand. And it's really taking that cycle and saying, is there right to use? Along this path, does that brand have the right to use that phone number? Has the service provider and anyone else involved in that passing of calls or texts, are they aware that this entity has that right to use? This is one of the things where Somos comes in. So we won't go to key takeaways yet. We'll have this slide up. And now I'm going to start talking to my guests. So that's a foundation. I hope everyone is on the same page of where we're at from a foundation perspective. And what I want to do is, because we normally start from the perspective from the US, I want to actually ask Katia a question. So Katia, first question's coming to you. I mentioned in the beginning that regulators and operators within the US are talking about right to use. How are they talking outside of the US when it comes to like right to use of telephone numbers and numbers transparency and in general? Can you educate us all on that?
Yeah, well, I'll do my best. So in Europe, for example, the discussion is very fragmented and not very mature, or not at all mature, to be honest. So the situation that we have in Europe is very different from US in terms of how numbers are used. So there's no feeling from the regulators that they need to build transparency on number use at all. Not yet. It's starting. It's just starting. I was to a workshop with the European regulators last week. It's only now that there's starting to be a discussion on the importance on knowing which numbers are valid versus not valid, on knowing who can use a number versus another. But it's really starting right now. So we are far from having the kind of more mature discussions that you have in US. And it's a bit awkward because the regulators do know that there's a problem with all these sub-allocation chains that we have, like in the graph here. They acknowledge that because they have not been able to set in place the right procedures, there's a clear lack of transparency. If there's an issue with the use of a number with a communication, they're just unable to trace back to who has issued the communication, who's supposed to be owner of that number, and who's supposed to be responsible for what happens. So there's that has actually been the starting point, not just a well thought process where you say, okay, I should start by knowing and acknowledging the numbers, and then building up on that, acknowledging which are the entities that can use it and for what use cases, etc., etc. So it's come more from the issue. Oh, there's a lack of transparency on these. On numbers of allocation, they tend to see a lot of fraud on numbers that are subleased, and they don't know how to handle it with law enforcement and tracing back and to the issue. So the discussion's just starting in a very fragmented manner, especially when it comes to voice communications. When it comes to SMS, I think it's a bit more mature, and it has translated into sender ID registries. There was a public consultation from CEPTCC, which is a group of European regulators, last year, and they recommended that the right way to go for SMS was the use of sender ID registries. Now, most European countries have not yet implemented the sender ID registry, so it takes a lot of time. It's a whole process, but some are starting to do it, but in different ways, and that creates a bit of also an issue for the industry, because each country is implementing a tool, something that could be a bit more harmonized in a different way. So. But at least there is something for the SMS. For the voice, frankly, when you talk to some regulators here in Europe, some even acknowledge that there is a lack of transparency, and they wish to keep it like that. Because in their mind, their speech is, okay, if we make transparency, then the fraudsters will use the information. Which of course I think is common knowledge in this group, at least, that is not right, it's rather the opposite. So it's there's a long education need here yet. And I have only been talking about Europe. In other countries, even Latin America, Colombia is taking an approach that is very comprehensive. In Mexico, for example, there's a very new obligation to register mobile numbers. So as an end user, I would have to go show my proof of my identity so that it can be linked to my phone number. And that is a very good first approach, but it cannot just work standalone. And they have stopped there right now in Mexico. So I think you guys have in US a very mature approach. The only other countries that are having reflections as going into the same direction with a multi-layer approach to get to something more concrete, or maybe UK, yet, I mean, not yet there, but they are moving into that. Colombia, not yet there, but moving into that, maybe Brazil. But frankly, yeah, there's a lot of work to do in other places.
And Stacy, thank you for that, Katia, because Stacy, like, you work internationally and domestically, and you hear that where you're like, wow, I have a lot going on the FCC in the US and that perspective, but to hear that we're actually further along from a US perspective in the right to use kind of area, like, talk to me a little bit about like what you're seeing from that perspective, because you get it from both sides and you get it voice of messaging too. So love to hear your Sinch perspective.
Yeah. So, Katia is spot on in some of that delay. In fact, even just internally, when we're going through a know your customer process, a lot of times feedback we'll get is, oh, we don't need to do that. That's a US thing, right? So while I feel like we are maybe a little bit of a step ahead, we're also not a step ahead, if that makes sense, because another thing that we talk a lot about, Katia and I on the One Consortium board is, right, the goal there is harmonization. And while all the countries are battling this, they have implemented other things in the past. So another thing I say a lot of times when we're focused on the number is, there's some countries where you have to sign in blood to get the number, and we toss them out like candy at a parade, right? Oh, you want a number? Here, have numbers. So you have that differentiation that has caused other issues in the US that are better locked down in other countries as well. So I think those conversations are finally happening that get us all on that same path and that same front, right? The United States already having stir shaken in place, which not all countries are going to implement stir shaken, and we've learned some of our own lessons on that path as well. Kind of gives us this path towards implementing right to use, and the way that that's laid out, and kind of builds on that next step where nothing is the silver bullet, right? So how do we continue to layer on to add to that? But it's really beneficial, I think, to start to see all the countries starting to come together on these conversations. And while everyone will have their own national regulations, kind of get us on that path of how this all starts to work together.
I'm really glad you brought that up, Stacy. So Katia, I want to come back to you. So, when we sometimes from a US perspective, we're like, oh, the US and the rest of the world. And we know that's not how it works either, right? Like individual countries are going to have their own rules. So what are the biggest challenges in establishing trusted number identity across international markets? Like how do you see that? What challenges do you see being presented today?
So the first challenge is that you need to have something implemented nationally to be able to start, correlating and to start collaborating with any other country. And that's where the harmonization that Stacy has been talking about is so critical. If you have complete different approaches, it becomes very, very difficult. Very basically, if we do not know in one country which are the numbers that and for what they are supposed to be used and by whom, how can you even, have a relevant discussion or process with another country to be able to validate communications that come from abroad. And that is the most critical part, not only having something nationally, but internationally agreed. Right now, it's only bilateral discussions, so FCC talking to Ofcom in UK. But, well, of course, there's a lot of activity happening between UK and US, but there's so much also. I mean, US have very tight relations with many other countries. There's a lot of communications coming from many other jurisdictions. So establishing a harmonized way of exchanging information. In this workshop that I mentioned I attended last week, so we had a panel where FCC presented their way of working and suggesting ways for other regulators in Europe to start building, all this layered approach. You have been through a long journey in US, so you have already done a lot. There was also Colombia in that panel. There was Ofcom, UK, Ireland was also, and India. And they were all in agreement that the word that was coming collaboration, international collaboration, and sharing information. We do not have that. We need more interaction and more discussion with regulators to explain to them what we need to enable that information sharing. That the industry knows what we need. We are the ones who have to tell them, at least in Europe, what we need to make things happen better. And then the one thing that, in my view, will be a very hard challenge is going to be to establish a trusted framework that works for all countries. Well, food for thought and a lot of work on that to come yet.
Absolutely. And I think trust. Oh, I'm sorry, Stacy, were you going to add?
Well, I was just going to add, we've focused a lot here in our conversation on regulation. I think there's impact on this at that number level on a global scale as well, from one of our favorite fights that we all get to play in every day, and that is the labeling of calls, right? So when you're looking at that right to use and what the analytics companies are able to see about that number from the forefront, it has impacts beyond just the regulation. So I think, on a global scale, as we're looking at the importance of that number and the history of that number and the true right to use of that number, there's a lot of impacts even beyond the regulation. But as important as that is, I don't want to lose fact that there's other ways that what things we're already doing are also impacted.
Yeah, Stacy, I would love for you to share with this audience, since you brought up that one example of labeling as like where number transparency might have created a compliance or a trust issue, right? Are there other instances where not being able to show, cryptographic proof that this entity has the ability to originate a call or a text? Or can you talk us through maybe some of those other number transparency issues? And if it's US focused, that's okay, because I think this audience relates to that. But if it's global, or Katia, you think of one that's global, that would be really great to kind of jump in and do that. But Stacy, I'll give you the mic. Like, what examples do you think maybe we're causing our own failure in trust, and in that trust framework because of some of the things we've put in place because of lack of right to use?
Yeah, absolutely. I think obviously one of the biggest challenges we all have when it comes to our customers is impersonation scams, right? Our own employees are being impersonated out on OTT applications like WhatsApp. You've got banks being impersonated. You've got retail companies. I just got one this morning wanting to know if I was really trying to buy that iPhone from Apple, right? So it's nonstop on the impersonation. And I think there's a lot of misconception in the United States on what Stir Shaken was truly meant to do. And Stir Shaken was never meant to stop those calls. It was meant to potentially stop spoofing, because you would have that ability to identify where those calls were originating from, whether or not that's where they were supposed to originate from. But one challenge that we've learned working with the enterprises is they don't always know where their calls are supposed to originate from, right? Who is that originating provider, and where is that really supposed to start? So I think right to use now takes that to that next level of, I am Bob's Pizza Shack, and this is my number, and I'm going to say that this is me, Bob, making this phone call. That really kind of puts some of that control back into the hands of the enterprise. And I can see, like I said, right, globally, we don't have Stir Shaken. So that becomes a little bit different, but I can see where that becomes a global benefit for Bob to have the ability to say, I am me, I am Bob, I am making this telephone call.
And how good would it be to be able to acknowledge from France, for example, that Bob has the right to issue calls? And so I think the share of information becomes critical. At least in Europe, we need a lot of regulatory support for that, because we have privacy rules that are so stringent that there's very little that any operator or carrier can do with the information they have. If I know you're dealing with an entity that is not trustful, I want to know it as an international carrier or as a French operator, because then I can also take measures before any of those communications gets to you. So I think it's all of that collaborative approach that needs to be enabled internationally, because I mean, if a call or a message can be killed before it gets to you, good, fantastic.
Yeah, and I think when you talked in the beginning, Katia, you were talking a little bit about, like being able to trace it back. And I think when we start thinking about right to use, instead of trace back being constrained within the carriers that handled it along the way, or the service providers that handled it along the way, imagine if you could trace it back all the way to the entity, right? Like, and I think that's what we're talking about. The basis of RTU is to that pizza shop, which was that example, like bringing it back and then being able to say, well, hey, this traceback doesn't go all the way to that entity. It didn't start with that entity, right? This becomes a bigger conversation of how the telecommunications networks are being leveraged compared to today, where it's like, oh, let's trace it back to the last carrier. Hey, last carrier, is that your customer? I think so. And I think that's where the reseller and wholesaler markets kind of come in. And this kind of breaks that barrier down. But I know, traceback, Katia, to your point, from a regulatory standpoint, is getting a lot of traction internationally. And do you think this would help it move a little bit further if there was a universal way to declare right to use of a telephone number? Do you think that would help in some of those traceback conversations?
I think so, definitely. So if there is one thing that all regulators I have been talking to, all of them will like to copy paste the traceback mechanism that you have in US, even if it's still difficult to stretch it and abroad. because then it depends on the willingness of the different players to provide the information. But they feel also jealous about that, but it's difficult to get it implemented, and that is one of these examples where you could think of relatively easily, and I'm quoting that, I know nothing is easy, but once you have national frameworks that work, you can relatively easily link them together. Yeah, I mean, yeah. There are so many things, but for that, you need to acknowledge what a number is, what it should be used for. Know your customer, who is supposed to be using that number for. So all of these things are like basic elements that need to stack before you can get to all of that. And I think that some of the regulators are starting to understand that it's not one solution. So it's not before, as Stacy was saying, you implement stir shaken that everything goes well. No, there are a number of things that need to happen prior and then even afterwards, and then learning from the others and sharing information with the others. And that also, fortunately or unfortunately, requires a bit of regulatory support.
I think another good example, Jaime, you mentioned LOAs when we first started, right? We've seen a bad uptick in fraudulent ports over the last couple of years, and the threat actors are getting better and better about, number one, they know that the LOA process probably isn't monitored quite like it should be, but two, with AI, developing the documentation they need to get past the LOA process. So I think that's another huge place where this comes into being a savior, is does it get us off of that antiquated paper trail? Yeah, we're not using fax machines anymore, but it doesn't mean we've come a whole long way. And does it kind of get us to where we know for sure that Bob wants to move his number from Alpha Telecom to Zeta Telecom, and that's truly what's occurring?
I love that. So I'm also hearing that there's the potential in what we're proposing from a cryptographic way to prove right to use, that there might be some scrutiny now put around some of those enterprises that are saying, this is my number and I want to use it. So Stacy, I know your business works with a ton of enterprises, as does ours. What do you think enterprises should be doing today to prepare for any increased scrutiny around number usage rights, having the ability to send a message, to make a phone call? Like what should that enterprise do today?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think there's anything more important for step one for an enterprise than know your inventory. Those are your numbers. They are your identity. And most of the enterprises you work with don't even know what their inventory is. So as you work with them and you guide them to truly understanding, they don't always know what their inventory is. They don't always know who their providers are if they want to implement that, right? Some really large enterprises may have multiple branches across the country or around the world, and they don't have a good handle on that information. So I would definitely say know your business to any business that's out there, and what you have in place and what you need to utilize to build those relationships that can kind of help you and guide you and understand how all of this goes. We speak a telecom language all of our own, and sometimes really understanding that isn't easy for them. So definitely get involved. I believe very strongly in cross-industry collaboration, and they're probably fighting the same people we are and see a different picture. So I think building those relationships and being ready to have those conversations, but to then be able to come to the table with what you have. The other one is protect your numbers. You do know them. And if you truly have numbers that are inbound only, put do not originate on those numbers. Protect your numbers, protect your brand. Right to use, all of this comes down to giving the enterprises their own ability to start to control some of their efforts. And some of those already exist today that allow them to do what's necessary to protect their brand.
And Katia, when you hear that, like, how is that message similar, outside of the walls of the US today?
Not yet. So what is true is that the issues, fraud issues enabled by telecommunications in the financial sector are accelerating some of the discussions. That is true. But they are not going exactly at the same pace or in the same direction. It's more regulators are still centering the debate so much on numbers of allocation. They don't realize how important it is to acknowledge that a set of numbers has been need to be managed by the entity. So if a number has been provided to Sinch, Sinch is responsible. And there should be a good know your customer, Stacy, saying, knowing who their customer is, what they will be using the numbers for. There is not yet that level of maturity elsewhere. It's not there. So they are good in other things, but certainly not in that. They are starting to discover the need for this right to use. And again, they have translated it in guidelines for sender IDs that have not yet been implemented in most of the European countries. And these guidelines were out, last year? So, and at times when they are implemented regulatory, they are not mandatory, really. So it becomes a bit fluffy, if I may. And it doesn't really work yet.
Okay.
The good thing, if I may, so the good thing is that right now, fraud is at the forefront in all discussions, not very organized yet. There's a huge regulatory review in Europe driven by the European Commission on the Digital Networks Act. And here, for the first time ever, so just so you get a view on where we stand, for the first time, there's an article on fraud. And there are a couple of articles that talk about numbering harmonization, whatever it means, not clear yet. But at least there's an open door to improving the way we handle numbers within Europe.
Okay. So hearing that, Stacy, could you give some motivation to Katia that there is good in there? So like, are there, how do number practices improve customer engagement? It could be along the phone side or the messaging side. I know you talked about labeling and or mislabeling before, but like, what are some good stories, right? So like if Katia is going to take, not just the word from Jaime, because we talk all the time, but like take the word from Stacy to put it in her pocket to say, hey, let's share this success story. What are some customer engagements that maybe have been improved because of numbering practices, good numbering practices?
Good question. So, there's a lot of good. I think we all know we have a long way to go, but there's been a lot of good. If we look back 5 years ago, we're telling a different story as well, even in the United States, right? So I think definitely that understanding, right? It becomes a challenge, it was what we've been saying the whole time. Every country at the national level has different rules around their numbers and their number assignments, right? Some countries, this is your mobile numbers, and these are your, right, and they're built into the blocks. Ours, not so much. But having that, I feel like I'm rambling. It's a difficult question to answer because I feel like while we do have some real wins, a lot of it has come from that collaboration effort. And us working with the other industries and starting to combat some of this and really trying to finally understand, hey, I am this bank and I do have the right to use this number. Us diving into it and going, I'm glad you think you do, but you don't, right? Or, hey, they're sending text messages from this number. Well, that's because when you ordered it, you text enabled it, right? Like having that ability to have those conversations and them understand how it is set up, I think that has brought us really far. I think to continue down the path, as Katia says, you're going to have the regulation, even in the United States, because now you're getting into that information sharing aspect of things, and there's a whole lot that you can and can't do. So we've had some real victories and some real wins, all the way down to law enforcement activity and getting things shut down and getting things stopped and getting it addressed on a grander scale. But so much of that has come from the collaboration. And I think this new path we are on of collaboration between countries, collaboration between industry and regulation, I think that is where our wins are going to come from, is the sooner we're all working together.
And if I may add to that, so in Europe, 5 years ago, like you say, the carriers wouldn't want to hear about, doing more to fight fraud. It's investment. And in general, they had the feeling that some of them were already doing a lot, many others were not doing enough. Now I think there's a better understanding that there needs to be a common effort, because otherwise, fraud is driving communications to shift to other channels so impacting negatively most of the carriers and operators. So I think there's now a better ground to have these discussions that are starting to happen between regulators and industry also in Europe. And I think that's where all the good can happen, because regulators are open to hear and the industry is also open to hear. But still to work on this collaboration, info sharing, which is like the hot potato in Europe.
And
also in the US.
Yeah. But I also think, Stacy brought up a little bit about, over-the-top providers and the use of telephone numbers in that space. And I think as the telecommunications industry as a whole, while yes, some of the fraudulent traffic is moving over the top, so is some of the legitimate business is moving, over the top. And I think there's a lot of conversations around as an operator, what fraud measures do you need to put in place to bring trust back into the telecommunications ecosystem, so that all of the other areas that people can choose to communicate, those don't become that primary place for it to happen. We want to maintain that traffic on the telecommunications network, but we can't unless we get it trusted, right? And I think that's really, really key. I'm gonna have one question for each of you. It's a surprise question. See how they both smile? They trust me so much. This is great. I get to do slides and I get to ask random questions. So if I gave you a magic wand tomorrow, and this magic wand could fix any one thing in telecommunications, what would it be?
Jesus, like that.
I'll go first.
Yeah. Oh, see, Stacy already has a full of them next to her, but yeah, go ahead. Here's the magic wand, Stacy.
Well, I need a few magic wands, but if I had one, the one that I would pick up first would be information sharing. I think we are very stifled, even within our own industry, of sharing information with each other, and then sharing information cross industry, where we're truly able to collaborate to get to the solution that we need to make this happen.
I'm afraid it was the same one. It's the I have been working and discussing with the regulators in Europe for already 2 years on that. Not going to be solved tomorrow, but I keep on working on that, because I believe that is the one thing that can change so many other things. I mean, we talk so much about network APIs, all the information and all the good you can do with those. Well, in most countries in Europe, you can just not implement network APIs. You cannot share the information that can safeguard my savings, my mother's savings, because operators cannot share the information with financial institutions. If a carrier A has found fraud and can share that information with carrier B, wow, that would be awesome. We cannot do it. So yeah, I mean, I think that would be like the most critical thing.
Great. All right. So, all right, here we go. I'm going to wrap up because I want to make sure we have enough time for questions. I'm going to attempt to go back and share another slide. And what we want to talk about is bringing it back to our conversation here, where we talk about key takeaways from this session. The first, RTU, is foundational to trusted communications. So if we know who is using the phone number, who has the right to use that phone number, what networks it can traverse, all those pieces around right to use, it's going to make it easier for us to pick out the people who don't have the right to use the telephone number. And at the end of the day, those are the people that are and entities that are going on and committing fraudulent acts against the human population. So it really is, it's foundational to trusted communications in the ecosystem environment. The transparency, we talk about information sharing, being transparent around numbering resources, starting with those national number registries and such, to support fraud prevention, to support compliance, and then support consumer confidence overall. Another takeaway is that global and domestic stakeholders are increasingly aligning around these trusted number identity frameworks. And RTU is a corner piece of this, but they are aligning around it. We're trying to find a path forward that can pave a way for trusted communications. And enterprises, carriers, service providers, each of you play a role in maintaining responsible number usage and governance. I think it's really key that we extend that now. We give the voice to that enterprise to say, I do want to speak up in this case. I do want to be a part of your ecosystem. I do want to assert my numbers. We also want to be able, from a telco ecosystem, to turn and say, hey, enterprises, we want you to manage your inventory, be in control of that, know what your numbers are doing, and know what services you've purchased in order to enable that. And breaking down those walls, I think CFCA as an organization has done a really great job, domestically and internationally, to really open up that communication, to open up that transparency around sharing information and the such. So with that, I'm done sharing. I know we have some time to take some questions. So I already laid the groundwork with a doozy that got Stacy and Katia thinking. But is there anything that this audience would like to know that we can open up for questions? Please put it in the chat. We'll be happy